Fire Emblem has been around in Japan for a long time, but this great strategy role-playing series only made its debut in North America a couple of years ago. 2 excellent Game Boy Advance titles later, Fire Emblem is hitting the GameCube with Path of Radiance, a game that sure doesn't mess with a successful formula. By once again combining the tense and exciting turn-based battles, as well as the richly detailed storytelling the series is known for, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance will more than satisfy fans as well as new players looking for a deep role-playing experience. The main character of the story is Ike, who's a fresh recruit in the Grail mercenary company led by his father. When the country of Dian attacks and sacks the capital of his nation, soon Ike finds himself in charge of the mercenary company much sooner than he expected. This is a move that threatens to tear the whole mercenary company apart, and as the rest of them retreat into the land of Gallia, racial tensions mount as the group is faced with this unusual group of characters that can turn into wild animals at will. The story may seem typical at first, but it has an unusual level of depth to it, much like you'd expect from previous Fire Emblem games. So there's this huge ensemble cast, there's a lot of rich history to the world, and you get a lot of character development even for some of the minor characters that you wouldn't necessarily expect would get much time in the spotlight. The story unfolds constantly through Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, during missions and especially in between missions, and it's always there to give you incentive to press on. Soon enough, you're really anxious to find out what's going to happen to all these characters and what's going to happen to this world, and sure enough, it feels like the fate of the world really is in your hands, since all the many characters in your ever-growing mercenary company live and die by your decisions. Although the game consists of a linear series of chapters, it does feel non-linear to a certain extent. You definitely feel like you're a participant in what's happening rather than just a spectator. There's lots of optional dialogue, and the battles themselves are highly consequential. So, depending on what happens, the makeup of the story does change depending on who ends up remaining alive at the end of it all. That's because one of the most controversial and most interesting aspects of the Fire Emblem series is that when characters run out of hit points here, they're dead and gone for good. There are no convenient resurrection scrolls or spells or anything like that. So even though characters can use magic and there's plenty of swords and sorcery type stuff, bringing the dead back to life isn't really something that these guys have mastered. At the heart of the gameplay is a rock, paper, scissors style balance system that looks really simple on the surface, but like the rest of the game is actually quite deep. To put it simply, spears beat swords, and swords beat axes, and axes beat spears. But then since you have these role-playing elements to go along with it, a very high-level character can easily beat down an opponent armed with a weapon that would normally put that opponent at the advantage. So there are a lot of layers to the depth, and it all comes together into something that's really quite interesting over the long haul as your characters keep gaining levels and keep getting a little stronger and stronger from mission to mission, but eventually you look back and realize that, wow, this guy started off as a total runt and now he's the toughest guy in my group. If you've played previous Fire Emblem games, all of this is going to be familiar to you, but there are some new elements of play that you'll notice. For instance, there's that Laguz race, the guys who can turn into wild animals. They're pretty interesting since when they're in humanoid form they can't attack at all, but every now and then they turn into their creature form, which makes them very, very powerful, but only for a short time until they transform back. So they're definitely a new consideration on the battlefield, but the rest of it consists of the same sort of swordsmen and fighters and Pegasus Knights and mages and those types of classes that you'll have experienced from previous Fire Emblem games. The other thing about Fire Emblem is that traditionally, in order for characters to become stronger, they have to participate in battle, which has always been an interesting element of play. This means that in order to make your weakling little archer into a powerful sniper, you're going to have to get him out risking his neck and risking his life, and only through a lot of hard-fought battles will he eventually grow strong enough. This time around, there's a shared experience system where in between battles, you can assign experience points even to characters who didn't participate and make them grow stronger. This is sort of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it lets you make characters that you're not using actively into viable combatants if and when some of your mainstay characters happen to fall. But on the other hand, it does almost feel like cheating that you could give experience points to characters who are basically just sitting out on the sidelines. That's probably the most noticeable difference in terms of the overall flow and feel of the gameplay. But then in between, you'll also notice some other stuff, like how characters can assign different skills to themselves, and how there's a lot more that happens in between missions now, where you can manage your battlefield and have your support conversations between the members of your force and stuff like that. Then again, the most noticeable difference between Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and the previous games is that this one is primarily in 3D, whereas those are 16-bit style Game Boy games. Unfortunately, the 3D isn't all that great, really. The game loses quite a bit of the personality that it had on the Game Boy Advance in translation to 3D, and the different 3D characters just tend to not look as good as their 2D counterparts. Fortunately, a lot of the overall look and feel of the combat is still very well intact, so when you see a massive critical hit take an opponent out in one swing, it still looks pretty satisfying. Also, all the artwork for the different characters is all hand-drawn in 2D and nicely animated and stuff like that. And even though the game seems to have this kind of generic anime look at first glance, you'll find out in due time that the characters are actually quite expressive and well-drawn, and there are just so many of them that they're instantly recognizable. Probably the best part of the game's presentation is the music, which really swells and works together with the tempo of the battle and as well as the story, and has a synthetic sound to it, but still is evocative of kind of the sweeping Lord of the Rings style epic feel of this adventure. This latest Fire Emblem game really doesn't take many risks with the formula, but in a way that's a risky move in itself. After all, these games pay an unusual amount of attention to things like story and character development, which most other games skimp on. But Fire Emblem Path of Radiance has some really good combat to match. The result is going to be just what fans of the series would want, and it's also just the sort of balance that most role-playing games aim for, but rarely achieve in practice.